I woke up before dawn, packed my car, and left my keys on the kitchen table. I thought I was doing something thoughtful, but the woman next door thought I had disappeared without a word. The morning I left, the world was still asleep. I woke before the sun had even thought about rising. The house was dark and quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every small sound feel louder than it really is. When I sat up in bed, the mattress creaked softly beneath me, and for a moment I just listened, to the distant hum of the refrigerator, the slow ticking of the kitchen clock, the faint whisper of wind brushing against the windows. For a second, I almost stayed in bed. Not because I didn't want to leave, but because leaving meant committing to the plan I'd been thinking about for weeks. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and rubbed the sleep from my eyes. The wooden floor felt cold under my feet as I walked into the kitchen. The clock on the wall read 4:37 a.m. Still plenty of time before the neighborhood woke up. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood by the sink while it brewed, staring out the window at the quiet street outside. The sky was still deep blue, the kind that only exists right before dawn. Across the yard, the porch light at Laura's house glowed softly. Laura. Just thinking her name had a strange way of settling something in my chest. She was 43, confident in that calm, graceful way that comes from living enough life to understand what matters and what doesn't. She had this quiet warmth about her, the kind that made people open up without even realizing it. I met her the week I moved in next door 2 years ago. Back then, I was 23, awkwardly carrying a box that was definitely too heavy for me, pretending it wasn't. She had walked over with a small smile, brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and said, "Need a hand with that?" I remember noticing the way her voice sounded, soft but steady, like someone who didn't rush her words. Since then, evenings had a habit of drifting toward her porch. Sometimes we'd sit on the wooden steps with cups of coffee or glasses of iced tea, talking about nothing important. Work. Music. The neighbors down the street who argued too loudly. Little things. But sometimes the conversations got quieter. Longer pauses. Moments where our eyes met and neither of us looked away right away. There had been times when she'd laugh and lightly place her hand on my shoulder for a second too long. Times when I'd catch myself noticing the faint scent of her perfume when she sat beside me. Those moments always lingered. And then we'd both pretend they hadn't happened. I shook the thought away and grabbed my keys from the counter. Outside, the air was cool and sharp as I stepped onto the driveway. My breath fogged faintly in front of me as I opened the trunk of my car and started loading the last of the boxes. The street was completely silent. One by one, I placed everything inside. Then I paused. My eyes drifted toward Laura's house again. Her porch light was still glowing softly in the dark. For a moment, I considered walking over. Knocking on the door. Telling her what I was about to do. But the whole point was that it was supposed to be a surprise. So instead, I walked back inside my house and placed my spare keys on the kitchen table, right where they'd be easy to see. Simple. Practical. I grabbed my jacket, stepped outside, and slid into the driver's seat. The engine started with a low rumble that sounded louder than it should in the quiet street. As I pulled out of the driveway, the headlights swept briefly across Laura's front window. I didn't notice the faint movement behind the curtain. And I definitely didn't realize that from inside that house, someone was watching my car disappear before sunrise. Laura noticed the car before she fully woke up. It was the low rumble of the engine that pulled her from sleep, a sound that didn't quite belong to the quiet rhythm of early morning. She turned slightly in bed, her eyes still half closed, listening as the sound rolled down the empty street. Then it faded. She opened her eyes and stared at the ceiling for a moment. The digital clock beside her bed read 5:02 a.m. too early for most people in the neighborhood to be leaving for work. For a second, she told herself it didn't matter. People left early all the time. Maybe someone had an early shift. Maybe it was a delivery truck. But something about the direction the sound came from made her curious. Laura pushed the blanket aside and walked slowly to the window. The floorboards were cool under her bare feet. When she pulled the curtain back just slightly, the dim blue light of early morning spilled into the room. Her eyes moved automatically toward the house next door. The driveway was empty. She blinked once, as if that might change what she was seeing. His car was gone. A strange, quiet feeling settled in her chest. For 2 years, that car had been there almost every morning when she looked out the window. It had become part of the background of her life, something steady, something expected. Seeing the empty driveway felt off. Laura told herself she was overthinking it. Maybe he had left early for work. Maybe he was visiting family. Still, the thought lingered in her mind throughout the morning. Later that day, as she returned from walking her dog, she slowed slightly when she reached the house next door. The curtains were drawn, the porch quiet. She hesitated at the edge of the driveway. He had asked her once, casually, months ago, to keep an eye on the place if he was ever out of town. Just in case, he'd said with an easy smile. You know how these old houses are. So technically, she had a reason to check. Laura stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking faintly beneath her weight. She leaned slightly toward the front window, peering inside. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The living room looked the same. The couch, the bookshelf, the coffee table. But then her eyes shifted toward the kitchen. And that's when she saw them. The keys. They were sitting right in the center of the kitchen table. Her brow furrowed. Why would he leave his keys behind? Unless. Laura straightened slowly, her fingers curling lightly around the porch railing. The empty driveway. The silent house. The keys left on the table like something forgotten, or something intentionally left behind. Her chest tightened in a way she didn't expect. She lowered herself onto the porch steps, the afternoon sun warming the wood beneath her hands. A memory drifted into her mind without permission. The two of them sitting here one evening a few weeks ago, the sky glowing orange as the sun set. He had been talking about opportunities, about possibly traveling more, maybe even moving somewhere bigger someday. She had smiled and encouraged him. Of course she had. Someone his age shouldn't feel tied down to a quiet street and a neighbor who was almost 20 years older than him. Still, as she stared at the empty driveway, a quiet thought pressed against the back of her mind. He left without saying goodbye. Laura exhaled slowly, her gaze dropping to the porch floor. It shouldn't have mattered this much. But for some reason, it did. By the time the sun finally began to rise behind me, I was already miles away from the neighborhood. The road stretched out in front of me in long, quiet lines, the sky slowly turning from deep blue to pale orange. Early morning light spilled across the empty highway, and the world felt calm in that rare way it only does before most people wake up. I rested one hand loosely on the steering wheel while the other held a paper cup of gas station coffee that was far too hot but strangely comforting. The drive was going to take almost 4 hours. 4 hours there. 4 hours back. A ridiculous amount of effort for something most people would probably consider small. But to me, it didn't feel small at all. I glanced at the passenger seat where the folded receipt from the antique shop sat on top of a small envelope. Inside the envelope was the last of the cash I had saved up over the past few months. The whole thing had started with a simple moment. About a year ago, Laura and I had been walking through the small downtown area a few towns over. It was one of those slow Saturday afternoons where neither of us had any real plans. We'd stopped for coffee, wandered past a bookstore, and eventually ended up standing outside a narrow antique shop with dusty windows and a wooden sign that swayed slightly in the wind. I hadn't even planned to go inside. But Laura had paused in front of the window. I remember the way the sunlight had caught in her hair as she leaned slightly closer to the glass, studying something inside. A porch swing. It was old but beautifully made, polished wood, curved armrests, thick metal chains. The kind of swing that looked like it had held decades of quiet conversations and slow summer evenings. Laura had smiled when she saw it. Not a big smile. Just a small, soft one. She reached out and lightly touched the window with her fingertips, almost as if she could feel the smooth wood through the glass. "That's beautiful," she said quietly. I nodded. "You should get it." She let out a small laugh and shook her head. "Some things are nice to look at," she said, her voice thoughtful, "but not meant for you." At the time, I didn't fully understand what she meant. But the way she said it stayed with me. Later that evening, when we were sitting on her porch, I noticed the empty space near the railing where a swing like that would have fit perfectly. The thought stuck in my head for weeks. Then months. Over time, I started putting aside small amounts of money whenever I could. Nothing dramatic, just skipping takeout here and there, working a few extra hours when the opportunity came up. Eventually I called the antique shop. Somehow, the swing was still there. So now I was driving across half the state before sunrise to pick it up. Not because she asked for it. Not because she expected it. But because every time I thought about the way her fingers rested against that shop window, I felt this quiet urge to change the ending of that moment. I wanted her to have the things she thought weren't meant for her. The road curved gently as the sun finally climbed above the horizon. Warm light filled the car, and I caught myself smiling slightly as I imagined her reaction. What I didn't imagine, not even once during that long drive, was that back home, Laura had already seen the empty driveway. And the keys on my kitchen table. And she had come to a very different conclusion about why I left. The first day passed quietly. Laura told herself she was being silly. People left town all the time. He was young, 25, with a whole life ahead of him. Of course he might travel, move somewhere new, chase opportunities beyond a quiet street and familiar neighbors. Still, every time she walked past the window that faced his driveway, her eyes drifted outside automatically. The empty space where his car usually sat felt strangely noticeable. She caught herself looking more than once. On the second day, she deliberately avoided looking at all. Instead, she buried herself in work. Emails, meetings, errands, anything that kept her mind busy. But when evening came and the neighborhood settled into its usual calm, the silence felt heavier than usual. Laura stepped onto her porch with a cup of tea, lowering herself slowly into the old wooden chair she usually sat in. Across the yard, his porch light remained off. His windows dark. The house looked exactly the same as always, but without him there, it felt like something important had quietly disappeared. She wrapped her hands around the warm mug, letting the heat seep into her fingers. For the past 2 years, evenings had often ended the same way. He would wander over casually, leaning against the porch railing while talking about something that happened at work. Sometimes he brought coffee. Sometimes he brought nothing at all except that easy smile that made conversation feel effortless. Those evenings had never been planned. They simply happened. A small laugh escaped her before she could stop it. She remembered one particular night during a thunderstorm last summer. The rain had been loud against the roof, the sky flashing with distant lightning. They had been sitting close together on the porch swing at the time, watching the rain pour down across the yard. At one point, a sudden crack of thunder had startled her. Without thinking, he had wrapped his arm lightly around her shoulders. It had only lasted a few seconds. Just enough to steady her before he awkwardly pulled his arm back again, clearing his throat like he wasn't sure if he had crossed some invisible line. She had pretended not to notice. But she remembered the warmth of his arm. The quiet safety of it. Laura exhaled slowly, staring out at the quiet street. The truth was, she had always kept a careful distance. Not because she didn't enjoy his company. Quite the opposite. But the age difference had always hovered quietly in the background of her thoughts. 18 years. Enough for people to notice. Enough for people to talk. And somewhere along the way, she convinced herself that it was easier to keep things exactly where they were, friendly, comfortable, uncomplicated. She had even caught herself stepping back a few times when their conversations drifted a little too close to something deeper. She thought she was protecting both of them. Now she wasn't so sure. The tea in her hands had grown lukewarm when she finally set the mug down beside her chair. Her eyes drifted toward his house again. She imagined him somewhere new, maybe in a bigger city, surrounded by people his own age. People who fit more naturally into the life he was building. A quiet ache settled in her chest. Not dramatic. Not overwhelming. Just a small, steady weight she hadn't expected to feel. Laura leaned back in the chair and let her gaze rest on the empty driveway one last time before standing up to go inside. As she closed the door behind her, she whispered softly to herself, almost like she was trying to make peace with the thought. He was never meant to stay here forever. What she didn't know was that several hundred miles away, he was already turning his car around to come back. By the time I reached the neighborhood again, the sun was already beginning to set. The sky was painted in soft shades of orange and pink, the kind of evening light that makes everything feel a little calmer than usual. After hours of driving, my shoulders were stiff and my eyes were tired, but the quiet excitement in my chest kept me wide awake. In the back of my car, carefully wrapped in thick blankets, were the wooden pieces of the porch swing. It had taken longer than expected to get everything loaded properly at the antique shop. The owner, an older man with patient hands and slow movements, had insisted on helping me wrap each piece so the wood wouldn't scratch during the drive. "You must really like whoever this is for," he'd said with a knowing smile. I had laughed it off at the time, but the truth was, he wasn't entirely wrong. As I turned onto my street, a familiar sense of comfort settled over me. The houses were quiet, porch lights flickering on one by one as evening settled in. It felt good to be back. I pulled into my driveway and shut off the engine, letting the silence settle around me for a moment. Home. For a second, I just sat there, imagining the look on Laura's face when she saw the swing. I could already picture her standing on her porch with that slightly surprised smile she always gave when something caught her off guard. The thought made me grin as I stepped out of the car. I opened the trunk and carefully lifted one of the wooden beams, resting it against my shoulder. The wood was smooth and solid, heavier than it looked. I had just started walking toward the porch when I heard a voice behind me. "So, you came back." The words weren't loud, but they carried easily through the quiet evening air. I turned around. Laura was standing at the edge of the driveway. Her arms were folded loosely across her chest, and the fading sunlight caught softly in her hair. She looked calm at first glance, but there was something fragile in the way she held herself. For a moment, I just stared at her, surprised. "Laura," I said, shifting the beam slightly in my hands. "Hey." She stepped a little closer, her eyes moving briefly toward the car and the pieces of wood inside the trunk before returning to my face. "You left pretty early the other morning," she said. Her voice was steady, but quieter than usual. I nodded. "Yeah. I had to get on the road before the shop opened." The slight crease between her brows deepened. "Road," she repeated. It took me a second to realize something about the way she was looking at me. Confused. Careful. Almost hurt. "I thought you left," she said slowly. "Left?" I echoed. Her gaze drifted briefly toward my house. "The car was gone," she continued softly. "Your place was quiet. And your keys were sitting on the kitchen table." That's when it finally clicked. The spare keys. The empty driveway. The silence. From her point of view, it must have looked like I packed up and disappeared without a word. I set the wooden beam down gently beside the car, suddenly understanding the weight behind her voice. "Laura, wait," I said quickly. "You thought I moved away." She didn't answer right away. Instead, her eyes dropped briefly toward the pieces of polished wood resting beside the trunk. "What is all this?" she asked quietly. I followed her gaze. Then I looked back at her. And realized the surprise I had planned might be doing something very different than I expected. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The evening air had cooled slightly, and the soft rustling of leaves from the trees lining the street filled the silence between us. Laura's eyes moved slowly from the wooden pieces leaning against my car to my face, as if she were trying to piece together something that didn't quite make sense. "What is all this?" she asked again, her voice quieter this time. I rubbed the back of my neck, suddenly feeling awkward in a way I hadn't expected. It's a porch swing, I said. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, confusion flickering across her expression. A porch swing. I nodded and stepped closer to the trunk, gently pulling one of the curved wooden armrests from beneath the blankets. Even in the fading evening light, the polished wood caught a soft glow. Laura stared at it. Then back at me. You drove out of town, for a porch swing. The question wasn't skeptical. It was more like she genuinely couldn't understand the logic behind it. I hesitated for a second before answering. Not just any porch swing, I said carefully. The one from that antique shop we stopped at last year. Her expression shifted instantly. I could see the moment she remembered it. The shop window. The dusty glass. The way she had paused to look inside. Her eyes softened slightly as she stepped a little closer, reaching out to run her fingertips along the smooth curve of the wood. You remembered that, she asked quietly. Of course I did, I said. The corner of her mouth lifted faintly, but there was still something uncertain in her gaze. But, why? She asked. I exhaled slowly. Because explaining that part felt more complicated than the drive itself. You said something that day, I began. You said some things are nice to look at but not meant for you. Laura looked down at the wooden armrest beneath her hand. I remember, she said softly. Well, I continued, shifting my weight slightly, that sentence stuck with me. She glanced up again. I kept thinking about it. And every time I sat on your porch, I noticed that empty space near the railing where a swing like this would fit perfectly. Her fingers moved slowly along the wood grain, thoughtful. So you drove 4 hours, she said quietly, because of something I said in passing. I shrugged lightly, feeling a little self-conscious now that the moment had actually arrived. It wasn't just that, I admitted. She tilted her head slightly. Then what was it? The question hung in the air longer than I expected. The truth was simple, but saying it out loud made my chest tighten. I looked at her, really looked. The soft lines at the corners of her eyes, the calm steadiness in the way she stood, the quiet warmth she carried even when she seemed unsure. You deserved it, I said finally. Laura blinked once, clearly caught off guard by the answer. For a second she didn't speak. Then she took a small step closer. Close enough that I could smell the faint scent of her perfume, something light and warm that I'd always associated with late evenings on her porch. Her hand moved away from the swing and gently rested against my arm. Not accidental. Not brief. Deliberate. I thought you left, she admitted quietly. Her voice carried a vulnerability I had never heard from her before. I thought maybe. I pushed you away without realizing it. My brow furrowed slightly. Pushed me away. Laura gave a small, nervous laugh. The distance, she explained. The times I stepped back when things started to feel complicated. I understood what she meant immediately. The quiet pauses. The moments where something deeper hovered between us but never quite crossed the line. She had always been the one to step away first. I figured you deserved someone easier, she continued softly. Someone who didn't have people whispering about the age difference. I met her eyes. And for the first time I said the thing I had been quietly feeling for months. I didn't stay because it was easy, I said. Her hand tightened slightly on my arm as she waited. I held her gaze and added gently, I stayed because of you. By the time the last bolt was tightened, the sky had turned a deep shade of blue. The street was quiet again, the kind of calm that settles over a neighborhood once dinner is finished and porch lights begin to glow softly in the dark. A faint breeze moved through the trees, carrying the cool scent of night air. The porch swing hung perfectly from the wooden beam above Laura's porch. For a moment, we both just stood there looking at it. It felt strangely satisfying seeing it finally in place, exactly where I had imagined it during the long drive back. Laura ran her hand gently along the polished wood of the seat, her fingers moving slowly across the smooth surface. It's beautiful, she said softly. I leaned against the porch railing, watching her. I was hoping you'd say that. She glanced over at me, a small smile appearing on her face. The kind of smile that started slowly but warmed everything around it. You really did all this just because of one sentence, I said. I shrugged lightly. It was a memorable sentence. She laughed quietly, the sound softer than usual in the evening stillness. Well, she said, stepping back slightly, I guess there's only one way to test it. She gestured toward the swing. Sit. I raised an eyebrow. Is that an order? Maybe, she replied, amused. I stepped forward and carefully lowered myself onto one side of the swing. The chains creaked gently as my weight settled onto the seat. Laura watched for a second before sitting down beside me. At first, she left a small space between us. The swing moved slowly back and forth with a soft rhythmic creak, the gentle motion almost hypnotic. The quiet street stretched out in front of us, dimly lit by porch lights and the distant glow of street lamps. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence didn't feel awkward. It felt peaceful. Laura rested her hands lightly on the wooden seat beside her, her fingers tracing small patterns against the smooth surface. You know, she said after a moment, this might have been a terrible idea. I glanced at her. The swing. She smiled faintly but shook her head. No, she said. Getting used to you being here. I felt a small laugh rise in my chest. That sounds like a risk I'm willing to take. The swing drifted gently forward again, then back. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once before everything returned to quiet. After a few more moments, I felt something shift beside me. Laura leaned slightly closer. Not much. Just enough that our shoulders brushed. She didn't move away this time. Instead, she let out a soft breath and rested her head carefully against my shoulder. The movement was slow, almost cautious, as if she were giving me time to pull away if I wanted to. I didn't. I stayed perfectly still, feeling the warmth of her beside me and the steady rhythm of the swing beneath us. After a moment, my hand moved naturally across the seat until it rested over hers. Her fingers curled slightly under my palm. Neither of us said anything about it. The quiet street stretched out ahead of us, peaceful and unchanged, but something between us had shifted in a way that felt both new and familiar at the same time. Laura gave a soft laugh under her breath. You realize this is exactly how trouble starts. I smiled slightly. Or maybe how something good starts. She didn't argue. Instead, she settled a little more comfortably against my shoulder as the swing moved gently through the warm night air. And for the first time, neither of us felt the need to pull away.